Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for having me in this important discussion and conversation. And I would very much would like to thank Salam for Democracy, the Gulf Institute, and Kant institutions for inviting me to take part in this discussion. And I want to be making straightforward points about the situation of human rights defenders in the Gulf countries. First of all, I would like to just not refer to the Arab Spring anymore. I usually don't do that, but I have noticed in the past 5 years basically that we are sort of like creating this sequence, causal relationship between the collapse or failure of the Arab Spring and the current situation. And I would like, in fact, to point out that there is a sort of an overwhelming status quo, specifically in the Gulf countries, that have, although it has been challenged at certain moments in time, in Bahrain, for instance, in 2011, some hopes for democratization and reform in Saudi Arabia around this period and before, and a movement for reform in the United Arab Emirates, and probably sort of like some also movement in Kuwait. They perhaps they have challenged the status quo in these countries, but nevertheless, this sort of phenomenal status quo still exists. And with that, I think, significant reference, we have to build a methodological sort of perspective on the situation in these countries. On one hand, we're talking about countries that, in principle, in general, do not have civil society as a sort of main characteristics of their function, of their existence. With the absence of civil society, there is also an accompanying lack of political space. Political space also correlates negatively with the lack of civil society. With the absence of political space, there are no exchanges, there are no transactions, if you will, in these countries. And by transactions, we refer to sort of the growth, the progress of independent entities, political, non-governmental entities that aspire to build hubs for citizens to participate, to engage actively in public life, and ultimately influence the decision making in these countries. None of this is happening in Gulf countries, and in fact, we're talking about countries that are ruled by monarchies, emirs, that tend, in addition to ruling the countries, to owning the countries as well. How does that sort of relate to the situation of human rights defenders? Well, as human rights defenders, they defend the sort of basic principles of freedom to associate, freedom to assembly, and freedom to express, which are the sort of the three determinants of the political or the civic engagement space in any country. And these human rights defenders are also in their capacities as sort of like envisioners of a better future for their people in their countries, but there are also champions of change, which unfortunately is not happening, but they represent symbols for their people, for their aspiration to become at one point, one day in time, hopefully soon, full empowered citizens who can take up their issues and causes with their governments. They can elect their governments freely. They can hold their governments accountable, they can fire their government, they can express critique of the way their government is handling their affairs and issues. So, and it's a delicate situation. When there is no political space, when there is no civil society, and when you are talking, and when we're sort of basically talking about governments that present itself as an owner of the country rather than just ruling the country, it is a sort of like a very sensitive, dangerous uh, situation that is full of risks. And no matter how sort of the reference to these human rights defenders as champion might seem poetic, but that is a sort of like a sort of like a fair and factual description. We're talking about people like Nabil Rajab in Bahrain, who basically sort of presented sort of serious challenges to the government's position on policies on the war against Yemen, on torture in jail, and he used peaceful tools to express his views and opinions. And but that is sort of the degree of tolerance of governments in the Gulf is basically sort of declining to, or has been declining to, a degree where there is no more tolerance. I mean, the only tolerance that human rights defenders like Nabi Rajab in Bahrain, or Hassan Kushak in Saudi Arabia, or other colleagues in the UAE, like Ahmed Mansour, for instance, who basically did nothing but being himself, being a sort of a man of the principle, a man who just defends, the rights of every citizen in his country. They all ended up in jail, and that is sort of like a dramatic, situation, a dramatic position for any person who would want to engage in human rights defense in these countries. In brief, and I'm sorry if I sort of made a sort of like a long introduction, but in brief, I just sort of think that we, as the sort of like the global, local, regional, international community of human rights, whether we were in the UN, or in non-governmental organizations, we should realize that the true support for the emergence of a true democratic, human rights respectful communities in the Gulf countries and the Arab world begins with lending support to these human rights defenders. First, by not forgetting them. People like Nabil Rajab in Bahrain, Ahmed Mansour in the Emirates, in the UAE, deserve us to pay tribute to their contributions and try as much as possible to keep their uh, their cause alive as much as possible. Thank you very much.